All right, so you're into tech, right? You like to get a lot of information efficiently, cut through the marketing stuff. I
Absolutely.
think that describes a lot of us, actually. And so today we're doing a deep dive into something really powerful in Azure. And this is something that I think a lot of folks could benefit from. We're talking about Azure Spot virtual machines, and we're going to get into the details. We're not going to do a marketing overview. We're going to really try to help you understand when you can use this, if you can use this, what are some of the things to watch out for.
Absolutely. It's definitely a great tool for optimizing your cloud spending and getting a lot more compute power for your budget. So really understanding the tool and how it works is key.
Yeah, so let's unpack this. Azure Spot virtual machines. If we were going to explain it to someone in simple terms, what are we talking about here?
So essentially, Azure has a lot of computing capacity.
Hmm.
Um, and a lot of times, not all of that capacity is being used. So Spot VMs allow you to essentially tap into that capacity that's not being used at a significantly reduced cost.
Significantly is kind of an understatement, right? I mean, just looking at the Azure documentation, it talks about potential savings of up to 90% compared to pay-as-you-go prices.
That's massive.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's you're getting access to the same infrastructure, same robust Azure infrastructure, but at a much lower price point.
Yeah.
And so yeah, up to 90% is a huge amount of savings, and so that can really impact your cloud spending and what you can do with your budget. But
Yeah.
as you can imagine, there's a few catches, maybe not really catches, but things to consider when using Spot VMs, when it makes sense to use them and when it doesn't.
So how does Azure offer these spot VMs at such a steep discount? Like what's the underlying mechanism here?
So the way it works is the pricing isn't fixed, so it operates on a variable model. And what that means is the price will fluctuate based on the available spare compute capacity in Azure and the current demand for it. You can kind of think of it like an airline ticket or a hotel room. Prices can go up or down depending on how busy things are. And the important thing to note is that you can actually set a maximum price that you're willing to pay for a Spot VM instance.
So it's kind of like a dynamic marketplace for compute, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And what happens if demand spikes or if the price goes above my maximum?
So if the price goes above the maximum that you set, or if Azure needs the compute capacity back for their regular customers, what will happen is your Spot VM can be terminated or evicted, as they call it, with a relatively short notice, usually around 30 seconds.
Evicted. Okay, well, so that tells me right away that this isn't something that I can use for like mission critical workloads that absolutely have to be up and running, 24/7.
Exactly, yeah. It's definitely not for workloads that need to be running 24/7. Spot VMs are really designed for workloads that can handle being interrupted. So things that can be restarted, things that are fault tolerant, or don't have, very strict time constraints.
So for the listener, for someone who's thinking about this, what are some of the specific ways that they could put this to use in their projects? I want to try to make this real world as much as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, a perfect example would be development and test environments. So if you're spinning up, multiple VMs to test out a new feature or to run automated tests in like a CI/CD pipeline, if one of those test VMs gets interrupted, it's usually not a big deal.
Right. It's like, oh, okay, start it up again.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just a minor inconvenience. So in those cases, spot VMs can save you a ton of money, because those tend to be temporary environments anyway. So that's a great example. Another example is certain high performance computing or HPC workloads, especially those that are what we call embarrassingly parallel, which basically means you can break them up into a bunch of smaller chunks, and then you can periodically save the progress. If a node gets interrupted, it's not a big deal. You can just restart that chunk of the computation.
Yeah.
Another example is batch processing jobs, so things like rendering complex graphics or transcoding video files. I was reading about jellyfish pictures, and they reportedly achieved an 80% reduction in their rendering costs by using Spot VMs strategically.
That's huge. Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of money. So, yeah, things like that. Big data analytics, because often, large data sets are processed in a distributed system that can tolerate the loss of individual nodes. Container-based applications, because those are typically designed to be resilient and easy to redeploy. Large-scale stateless applications, similar idea.
See, that containerization makes a big difference.
Makes a huge difference, yeah. And then lastly, machine learning and AI workloads, especially for training models. The training process can often be checkpointed, and if there is an interruption, you can just resume from the checkpoint.
So whether you're, playing with AI algorithms or you're crunching massive data sets, this could be a way for you to get a lot of compute power at a fraction of the cost.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, we've been talking about the core concept. What are some of the key features and practical considerations that our listeners should be aware of?
One really great feature is the ability to actually view the historical pricing and eviction rates for different spot VM types. And you can do that right in the Azure portal. So you can kind of get a feel for, this particular VM series, how often does it get evicted?
Yeah.
What does the pricing look like? And that will allow you to make a more informed decision.
Yes, you can kind of make a judgment call about, what's the balance between cost savings and, stability of that compute.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another thing to consider is how spot VMs work with scale sets.
Hmm.
So if you're not familiar with Azure Virtual Machine scale sets, they allow you to manage a group of identical VMs as a single unit. And that's incredibly useful for interruptible workloads because if some of your spot VMs get evicted, the scale set can automatically try to bring new ones online.
So it's kind of managing that fluctuation for you.
Exactly. Yeah. So it helps you maintain that desired compute capacity that you're looking for. Another thing to consider, we kind of touched on it before, but when a spot VM does get evicted, you have a couple different options in terms of what happens to it. They call it eviction policies, and there's two main ones, deallocate and delete. So if you choose deallocate when your spot VM is evicted, it's essentially stopped. Yep. And you're no longer being charged for the compute time. But any other resources that are associated with it, like the OS disk, the network interfaces, those will continue to incur charges. But the important thing is with the deallocate policy, any data that's stored on your persistent disk storage, it remains intact. So it's kind of like you're just pausing the VM, right?
Yeah.
And then you can manually restart the VM later on if the capacity becomes available and if the price is within your limits. Now, if you choose the delete policy, when the VM is evicted, it's gone. And everything associated with it gone as well.
It's like wiped off the face of the earth.
Wiped off the face of the earth, yeah. So all the data on the disks, both temporary local disks and persistent disks, it's all deleted. So that's typically used for more, ephemeral workloads where, data persistence isn't as important.
Yeah, makes sense.
Another thing to keep in mind is that there's no guaranteed minimum runtime for a spot VM. So it could run for a few minutes, it could run for several hours, it could even run for days. But you should be prepared that it could be evicted at any time.
So you don't have that predictability. That's the trade-off for the cost saving.
Exactly, yeah. One question that comes up a lot is, if I have existing VMs running, can I convert them to spot VMs? And the answer is, unfortunately, no. The way spot capacity is managed, it has to be configured at the time of creation.
Right.
So it's something you have to decide when you're setting up the VM. Do I want this to be a spot VM or do I want this to be a regular pay-as-you-go VM? And there's also some VM series that are not eligible for spot pricing. So notably, this suppressed core VM series, which are already like very low-cost burstable workloads.
Right.
Any VMs that are offered as promotional SKUs and the burstable B series VMs, those are not available as spot VMs.
So if it's already like dirt cheap, probably not going to get much cheaper, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you're not going to get spot pricing on those. Another thing to keep in mind, there's no SLA for Azure Spot VMs. So that's an important consideration. If you're running something that's, mission critical, you need that SLA, then spot VMs are probably not the right choice.
So that's another big trade-off. Big cost savings, but no guarantee of uptime.
Right. And they also have their own separate quota pool. So it's separate from your regular VM quotas. So if you need to increase your spot VM quota, you would have to go through the same process for requesting a quota increase as you would for any other Azure service.
Okay, makes sense. Now, just to dive a little bit deeper into costs, the documentation mentions that any maximum prices you set are entered in US dollars, even if my Azure bill is in a different currency. Why is that?
So the reason for that is for consistency and transparency across all the regions. So to make sure that everyone's bidding on the same playing field, they require that you specify your maximum bid price in US dollars.
Yeah, it's like a common unit of measure across the globe.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And another thing, a lot of customers have enterprise agreements with Microsoft that give them discounts on their regular Azure usage. But those discounts do not apply to spot VMs.
Makes sense. I mean, they're already so cheap, they're already discounted. You don't get a further discount.
Right, they're already heavily discounted. So, yeah, no additional discounts on top of that. Um, and the last thing I wanted to mention is, Spot VMs are actually the successor to something called Azure Low Priority VMs.
Oh, right.
So low priority VMs were kind of the previous iteration of this, and they were a little bit more limited. And Spot VMs are kind of the evolution of that. They offer more flexibility. They have this market-based pricing model, and they're just overall a better solution for this use case.
So they kind of took what was good about low priority VMs
Yeah.
and improved upon it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so to wrap all of this up, what's the core value proposition of Azure Spot virtual machines? Why should our listeners care about this?
So the main reason to care about Spot VMs is they can save you a lot of money on your Azure compute costs.
Mm.
Especially for workloads that are flexible, that can tolerate being interrupted. It can be a real game changer.
Absolutely.
You can do so much more with your budget if you're using Spot VMs strategically.
So, if you're doing development and testing, if you're running batch processing jobs, if you're doing high performance computing, or you have these large scale stateless applications, this could be a really, really good option for you.
Exactly.
So for you, the listener, where can you use this? Think about the projects that you're working on right now, the projects that you're going to be working on in the future. Think about how you might be able to use this.
And I would highly encourage you to go into the Azure portal, take a look at the documentation, see what the pricing looks like for the specific VM series that you're interested in. Play around with it.
Yeah, I mean, we've given you kind of the high level overview, but now it's up to you to do some digging and see how this can work for your specific needs. Awesome. Thanks for joining us. This has been a really fun deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Take care.